I never expected to fall for a man like him. A man who built his life under the sun, whose hands were rough from years of hard work. My boss. My employer. The man who could end my career with a single word. But out here in the open fields, where the world felt quieter and the nights stretched long, something changed between us. And once it started, there was no stopping it. Welcome to a story of forbidden attraction, slow-burning tension, and a love that defies expectations. A young farmer and his powerful boss, two men bound by the land, yet torn by their own fears. Will they fight their feelings, or give in to something neither of them saw coming? Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. This helps us bring more stories filled with passion, tension, and unforgettable romance straight to you. Now, let's get into it. Agricultura Gay, where love grows in the most unexpected places. I had been working on James Calloway's farm for only 3 weeks, but it already felt like I had lived here forever. Days started before sunrise and ended long after sunset, my body aching from the relentless labor. I wasn't afraid of hard work. I had grown up around it. My father was a farmer, and I had spent enough time in the fields to know the rhythm of the land. But working under James Calloway was different. He wasn't just another farm owner. He was the farm owner. The man who had inherited this place from his grandfather and built it into one of the most successful farms in the county. He was respected, admired, and completely untouchable. And I was just another farmhand, one of the many young men who had come looking for work, eager to prove myself. But somehow, I couldn't stop noticing him. James was intimidatingly handsome, tall, broad shoulders, his body built from years of working the land himself. His sun-kissed skin carried the marks of long days in the field, his sharp green eyes always scanning the farm like he could see every detail, every mistake before it even happened. And he barely spoke to me, not in a way that was rude. He just wasn't the kind of man who wasted words. He gave orders, expected them to be followed, and rarely let emotion slip into his tone. And yet, I had seen glimpses of something else. The way his eyes lingered on me just a second too long when I worked. The way he cleared his throat when I caught him looking. The way his hands hesitated when he passed something to me, as if debating whether to touch my fingers or not. Maybe I was imagining it. Maybe I just wanted to imagine it. But there was something there, something unspoken. It happened in the late afternoon, when the sun hung low in the sky, casting long golden shadows over the fields. The air was thick with the scent of fresh hay, and my shirt clung to my back, damp with sweat from the long day. I was loading bales onto the truck when James approached, his boots crunching against the dry earth. "You're good at this," he said simply. It startled me. He had barely spoken more than 2 words to me since I arrived, and now he was complimenting me? I wiped my brow with the back of my hand. "Thanks. Grew up around this kind of work." He nodded, studying me for a moment. I could feel his eyes tracing the lines of my arms, the way my muscles flexed as I lifted another bale onto the truck. Something shifted in the air. I felt it before I understood it. His gaze lingered, his lips pressing together slightly as if he was thinking too hard about something. Then he looked away. "Keep at it. We start early tomorrow." And just like that, he was gone. But the moment stayed. His stare, his hesitation, the weight of something neither of us were ready to admit. Later that night, after the work was done and the other farmhands had gone to the bunkhouse, I stayed out by the fence, staring at the endless stretch of land before me. I was thinking about him, thinking about how ridiculous it was to feel this way about my own boss. The door to the main house creaked open, and I turned just in time to see James stepping outside. His shirt was unbuttoned at the top, his sleeves rolled up. He looked less like my boss and more like a man. A man I shouldn't want. He spotted me but didn't go back inside. Instead, he hesitated for a second before walking toward me. "You should be asleep," he said. I let out a small chuckle. "Could say the same to you." He exhaled, crossing his arms as he leaned against the fence beside me. We stood there in silence for a moment, just the sound of the crickets filling the night air. Then he said something I wasn't expecting. "You like it here?" I turned my head toward him, surprised by the question. "Yeah," I admitted. "It's tough, but I like the work. I like the quiet." He nodded, staring out into the darkness. There was something different about him tonight, something softer. "Good," he said after a while. "You work hard. That's not something I say lightly." The compliment sent warmth through my chest, but it was the way he looked at me after that, really looked at me, that sent something else coursing through my veins. A slow, intense stare. One that held. One that almost felt like an invitation. I swallowed hard, my heart hammering. I knew this moment was dangerous. If I reached for it, if I let myself believe there was something between us, I wouldn't be able to take it back. So I didn't move. Neither did he. And yet, standing there in the cool night air, I felt it more than ever. Something was happening between us, something I didn't know how to stop. And maybe I didn't want to. The next morning, I woke up before dawn, the way I always did. The bunkhouse was quiet, the other farmhands still lost in sleep. But I couldn't stay in bed. Not after last night. Not after that look. James had stood next to me by the fence, and for a brief moment, I swore there was something between us. A hesitation, an unspoken thought. But as much as I wanted to believe it was real, a part of me wondered if I was just fooling myself. I dressed quickly, throwing on my work clothes and stepping outside. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and morning dew. The sky was a soft shade of gray, the sun just starting to creep over the horizon. I walked toward the stables, the familiar sounds of restless horses filling the silence. I needed to focus on my job, not on my boss. But the second I reached the barn, I stopped in my tracks. James was already there. He was in the middle of saddling one of the horses, his sleeves rolled up, the muscles in his arms flexing as he tightened the straps. His expression was unreadable, his jaw set like it always was in the mornings. He hadn't noticed me yet, so I stood there for a second watching him. And then, as if sensing my presence, he turned. "Didn't expect anyone up this early," he said. His voice was low, thick from sleep. I shrugged. "Figured I'd get a head start." He nodded, turning back to the horse. "Good. We could use the extra hands today. Cattle needs moving before the storm rolls in." I stepped inside, grabbing a saddle from the rack. I could feel his eyes flicker to me briefly, watching as I worked, but he said nothing. The silence stretched between us, thick with something unspoken. I wanted to ask about last night, about the way he looked at me, about why he came outside at all. But instead, I said, "You always wake up this early?" He let out a small breath, something close to a chuckle. "Yeah, comes with the job." I glanced at him. "You ever get tired of it?" His hands stilled on the reins for just a second. Then he shook his head. "It's in my blood. Don't know how to be anything else." There was something about the way he said it. Like it wasn't just about the farm, but something bigger. Like he had no choice in the matter. I didn't push. Instead, I focused on saddling my horse, trying to ignore the way my heart felt heavier than usual. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of hard work. We rode out into the fields, rounding up cattle, moving them to safer ground before the storm. The wind had started picking up, dark clouds gathering in the distance. The smell of rain hung thick in the air, and I could feel the tension rolling in along with the weather. James rode beside me for most of it, quiet and focused, but every so often I caught him looking at me, quick glances like he wasn't sure if he should or not. I didn't know what to do with that. By the time midday rolled around, we were finishing up near the creek, securing the last of the cattle. Most of the other farmhands had already headed back, leaving just me and James. I was about to say something, maybe some meaningless comment about the weather, when suddenly my horse spooked. I barely had time to react before it reared back, my grip slipping on the reins. I lost control, my balance tipping as the ground seemed to shift beneath me. And then, I was falling. The impact knocked the breath from my lungs, my back slamming against the dirt. My head spun, pain shooting through my side. Before I could even process what had happened, James was there. "Don't move," he ordered, already kneeling beside me, his hands on my shoulders. His touch was firm, steady. "You okay?" I blinked up at him, still dazed. "Yeah, just got the wind knocked out of me." He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. Damn horse, it must have caught the scent of something. I tried to sit up, but his hands tightened. "Easy." It was only then that I noticed how close he was. His face hovered just inches from mine, his eyes scanning me carefully. His breath was warm against my skin, his grip still firm on my arms. For a second, neither of us moved. The world around us faded. The distant cattle, the rustling grass, the storm threatening in the distance. All I could hear was the sound of my own heartbeat. I swallowed hard. "I'm fine, James." His eyes flickered to my lips for just a second. Then, as if snapping out of something, he let go. He stood quickly, taking a step back, running a hand through his hair. "Be more careful next time." His voice was rougher now, like he was forcing it back to normal. I exhaled shakily, pushing myself up. "Yeah, got it." He turned away, adjusting the saddle on his horse, his movements stiff. But I had seen it. I had felt it. For just a moment he almost let something slip, and now I couldn't stop wondering, was he fighting it as much as I was? The storm rolled in just as we returned to the barn, the sky splitting open with a downpour that soaked us within minutes. Thunder rumbled across the fields, shaking the earth beneath our boots. I was still rattled from the fall, but James had barely spoken since he pulled me from the dirt. I stole glances at him as we unsaddled the horses, water dripping from our hair, our clothes clinging to our skin. His jaw was tight, his movements a little too sharp. He was avoiding looking at me. I didn't know if it was because of the way he had held me when I fell, or because I had seen that flicker of hesitation in his eyes, the moment where he almost did something. The air between us felt charged, even with the rain pounding against the barn roof. "I told you to be careful," James finally muttered, breaking the silence. I let out a breath, running a hand through my wet hair. "Yeah, well, horses don't always listen." He exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. "Could have been worse." I leaned against the stall, crossing my arms. "You always this worried about your farmhands?" His hands stilled on the saddle strap. For a second, I thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, slowly, he turned toward me. His green eyes locked onto mine, unreadable. "I don't like seeing people get hurt," he said. His voice was quieter now, less guarded. The rain softened, turning into a steady rhythm against the roof. I swallowed. "You barely know me, James." He didn't blink. "That doesn't mean I don't care." Something inside me tightened. For weeks, I had convinced myself that the lingering glances, the hesitation in his voice, the tension between us, It was all in my head, that I was just a farmhand, and he was just my boss, and there was nothing more to it. But now, standing here in the dim barn, alone with him, drenched from the rain, I wasn't so sure. I took a slow step forward. Not enough to be obvious, but enough that I could feel the space shrinking between us. James didn't move. I hesitated, then said the one thing I shouldn't have. "Why do you look at me like that?" His lips parted slightly, but no words came out. His fingers twitched at his sides, like he wanted to grab something, or someone. I felt my heart hammering. "James." He cut me off by taking a step back. His expression shut down so fast it made my chest ache. "This conversation's over." His voice was sharp again, cold. I barely had time to react before he turned on his heel and walked out into the rain, disappearing into the night. I stood there, breathless, water dripping from my hair, my pulse still racing from the moment that never happened. But it almost did, and that was enough to make me certain. James Calloway was fighting something, and I wasn't sure how much longer he could keep winning. The next morning, I woke up with the weight of last night pressing down on me. I kept replaying the moment in the barn, the way James had looked at me, like he wanted something he couldn't let himself have, the way his body had tensed when I stepped closer, and then the way he had shut down and walked away. I hadn't seen him since. The bunkhouse was already empty when I got up, the other farmhands having left before sunrise. I dressed quickly and made my way to the barn, trying to shake the restless energy still clinging to me. James was there. He stood near the fence, talking to Tomas, one of the older workers. His stance was relaxed, arms crossed, but the second he spotted me, his whole body stiffened. I swallowed hard. Was he going to keep pretending nothing happened? "Morning," I said, keeping my tone even. James gave a slight nod but didn't meet my eyes. "We're working the west field today," he said, voice clipped. "Cattle need to be moved before the heat picks up." That was it? That's all he was going to say? I clenched my jaw. Fine. If he wanted to pretend last night never happened, I could play along. We worked in silence for most of the day. James avoided me, kept his distance. But I could still feel him, his presence, his gaze, whenever he thought I wasn't looking. By late afternoon, we were loading supplies onto the truck when it happened. I bent down to lift a crate, but my grip slipped. Before I could react, James was there. His hand shot out, catching the other side of the crate before it could crash to the ground. Our fingers brushed. My breath hitched. James froze. For a single, charged second, neither of us moved. His palm was warm, rough from years of work. His chest barely a foot away from mine. I could see the tension in his throat, the way his pulse beat just a little too fast. I swallowed. "James." He let go like I burned him. The crate dropped between us, landing with a dull thud. His jaw clenched, his hands curling into fists at his sides. "Be more careful," he muttered. Then, before I could say anything, he turned and walked away. Again. I exhaled sharply, frustration burning in my chest. I wasn't crazy. He felt it. The way he pulled back, the way his hands trembled when they touched mine. He was fighting it, and I was getting real tired of letting him win. That evening I stayed out longer than usual. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky a deep shade of indigo, but I wasn't ready to go back to the bunkhouse. I was restless, frustrated, tired of pretending. James had spent the entire day avoiding me, but I felt him every second of it. The way he kept his distance, the way his eyes flickered toward me when he thought I wasn't paying attention, the way he reacted every time we got too close. I wasn't stupid. He was fighting something. And maybe, just maybe, I was done letting him fight it alone. I leaned against the fence, staring out at the dark fields stretching into the night. The wind was cooler now, carrying the faint scent of rain from somewhere in the distance. The world felt still, like it was waiting for something to happen. And then, footsteps. Heavy boots against the dirt. I turned just as James came into view, stopping a few feet away. He didn't look at me right away. His hands were shoved into his pockets, his jaw tight, his eyes locked on the ground. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then, "I saw you out here," he said, his voice quieter than usual. I let out a slow breath. "Couldn't sleep." He nodded, shifting his weight. "Me neither." Silence stretched between us. He was hesitating. I could see it in the way he tensed, the way his fingers twitched at his sides. I swallowed, my heart pounding. "You gonna keep running, James?" His eyes snapped up, sharp and startled. He knew what I meant. The air between us shifted. I could hear the way his breath caught, the way his boots scuffed against the dirt as if he was about to step back again. But this time, I didn't let him. I moved first. One slow step forward, then another. His lips parted slightly, his shoulders rising as he inhaled sharply. He didn't move away. "Tell me I'm wrong," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. His throat worked as he swallowed. His fists clenched. I waited. And then, finally, he broke. In one sharp motion, James grabbed me by the front of my shirt and pulled me in. His mouth crashed against mine, rough and desperate, like he had been holding back for far too long. I barely had time to react before his hands were gripping me tight, like he was afraid to let go, like he had lost all control of himself. And I kissed him back. Hard. Because this was what we had been dancing around since the moment I set foot on this farm. And neither of us could stop it now. James pulled away first, his breathing ragged, his hand still gripping my shirt like he wasn't sure if he wanted to push me away or pull me in again. His forehead rested against mine, his chest rising and falling as if he was trying to steady himself. I could feel the heat of his skin, the tension still thick between us, but now there was no more pretending, no more running. His voice came out rough. "This shouldn't be happening." I swallowed hard. "Then why did you kiss me?" Silence. He exhaled sharply, finally stepping back, his hands lingering for just a second before he let go of me completely. The loss of his warmth sent a chill through me, but I didn't move. James ran a hand through his hair, pacing slightly, like he was trying to work through something in his head. "This is a bad idea," he muttered. I crossed my arms, my heart still racing. "You keep saying that, but you're the one who kissed me." His jaw clenched. "I know." I waited for him to say more, to explain, to make sense of what just happened. But he didn't. He turned away, staring out at the dark fields, his hands braced against the fence. I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he was struggling with himself. I took a step closer. "James?" He didn't look at me. "This isn't just me, is it?" I asked, my voice quieter now. His hands tightened on the wood. The silence stretched, the wind rustling the tall grass around us. Then finally, "No," he admitted. It was barely a whisper, but I heard it. Something in my chest tightened. I took another step toward him, closing the space again. "Then what are you so afraid of?" James let out a rough laugh, shaking his head. "Everything." I reached out before I could stop myself, my fingers grazing his forearm. He tensed at the contact, but didn't pull away. "You think I don't know what this is?" he asked, finally turning to face me. His green eyes burned with something I couldn't quite name. Fear, want, frustration. "I've been trying to fight it since the day you got here." I held his gaze. "And?" His throat worked as he swallowed. "And I don't think I can anymore." The words hit me like a hammer, knocking the breath from my lungs. James had spent weeks pretending, shutting down, pulling away. But now, in the middle of the night, under the wide-open sky, he was finally admitting it. This thing between us? It was real, undeniable, and neither of us knew what the hell to do about it. James stared at me, his breathing uneven, his hands flexing like he wanted to reach for me again, but didn't trust himself to. I took a step closer. He didn't move away. That was all I needed. I reached up, fingers barely brushing his jaw. His skin was warm, tense, like he was holding himself together by sheer force of will. "You don't have to fight it," I murmured. James let out a shaky breath, eyes closing for just a second. Then he pulled back. Not far. Just enough. "This isn't simple," he said, voice rough. I swallowed. "It could be." His eyes met mine, and for the first time, I saw it. The war inside him. But before I could say another word, he turned and walked away. Again. And this time, I didn't stop him.